Christian congregations and communities can become life-giving spaces and places for exceptional children, adults, and their respective families. Today, our guests will share from their personal and professional experiences and how to minister to the faith formation and spiritual needs of exceptional children and people of all ages. Please stay tuned. Welcome to Perspectives on Faith and Culture. I'm Karen Crozier, and today joined with me is Lisa Keith, who is Assistant Professor of Special Education at Fresno Pacific University, and next to her is Quentin Kennison, who is Associate Professor of Christian Ministry and Leadership at Fresno Pacific University. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So let's get into the issue of how do we, as churches, congregational leaders and members, care for people with disabilities. Can you share from your personal and professional experience, Lisa, on how you have experienced as churches being present or not in caring for those with disabilities?
My experience has been as a congregational member. When I was diagnosed with a chronic illness quite a few years ago, I experienced not the warm reception that I had hoped for. And so along with my education, being a special education teacher, it's made me want to share that knowledge and teach those in the congregation what it means to be a person with a disability.
So at first didn't feel like your needs were being cared for, and then you went into this teacher role instead of just maintaining a victim role. Is that clear?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. I think it's important to stand up and to be a role model, hopefully for children who may have the same disability that I have.
So at what time in your life did that happen where you felt like you had the courage to become a teacher in the process in the life of your congregation?
It's been a long process. As I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, I also had the opportunity to become a teacher to students with bipolar disorder. And it was then that I learned that there was a lot of stigma facing these children and adults as I became more and more involved in the mental health community. I decided then that it was important for someone to speak out. And because I was already somewhat respected in my field as an educator, I felt that I had the wherewithal to step out and speak out about this is who I am and this is what I have, and it doesn't change me as a person.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Quentin, could you please share your particular experience within congregational life?
Sure, absolutely. When I was a young man in youth age, I was a part of a congregation that had a young man who came to our congregation who has cerebral palsy. And he and his family attended our church faithfully and regularly. His family didn't have the means to really give him the kind of proper care that maybe they would have liked to have, or that maybe he should have had. And yet they came to church faithfully. They were part of the life of our congregation, and we loved having him there. But I also learned at that time that he could also at times be somebody who was well received, and then occasionally maybe he would bear the brunt of the jokes, the things, the cruelty that people can have. And so in congregational life, while there's a growing number of people who are in the elderly side of things that have disability, it's oftentimes with the children and then with the youth where we see maybe the most difficulties arise. It's that the child maybe who yells out in the middle of a service when people are supposed to be quiet, or an autistic disorder where the Sunday school teachers don't know quite how to handle the situation. And so there's kind of this both and experience that occurs in congregational life. Sometimes we do it well, and other times we do it very poorly.
As you talked about the gentleman who with cerebral palsy, and there was times when you observed he was embraced. Can you name what were the specific examples or practices in which the embrace took place, and what were those specific actions where he was shunned from your experience as a young man in the life of the church?
So in this particular church at the time, we had an open kind of outside volleyball area, which in Phoenix, Arizona was kind of ridiculous, but we played anyways. 115 were playing volleyball. And he would be one of those kids we would say, come on, come be included, participate with us, play along with us, and he would love that. But there are other times, and maybe the tragedy is that the times maybe were more essential to his spiritual care, where we didn't take him as seriously. We would ask a question about faith, and we didn't stop to probe and see where maybe this young man could have enhanced our understanding of what God was doing, what God was about. Or we would go out together after church as a youth group and not think to include him in that. And I will say there also were members in our congregation who did a better job of that than others. I think that's also part of their life, and oftentimes it comes around their own personal experiences with disability.
Yes, thank you for those specific examples. As we talk about the language of disabilities and people who suffer with disabilities, and Johnny and Friends of Central California, Central Valley, uses the language with disabilities. What are some other terms that may or may not be more appropriate when we talk about people who suffer with a diagnosis of mental illness, a physical or mental disability? What is some of the more common appropriate language from your perspective and experience? Quentin, you want to begin with that?
Yeah, I think that there's, well, let me back up and say I think there are a number of different ways in which people are grasping and grappling with this language. How do we use language that helps to communicate effectively what it is we're talking about without being demeaning in the process? You know, in my growing up years, we used the term handicapped. Somebody was handicapped, right? Or later we tried to be more sensitive, and so they're disabled. And even in doing that, maybe they weren't. I've heard terms differently abled used as another possibility. I know exceptionalities is another term that's being used on the horizon. And I think that those are all ways in which we're trying to grasp and grapple with these concepts. I would also go so far as to say that the one thing that I have appreciated more recently, and particularly, you know, Johnny and Friends uses this approach, and others using this approach as well, is the idea of beginning with people first language. That I am not my disability, I am a person who may be affected by that, or I may be a person who with an exceptionality. And I think the danger is no matter what language we use, we can always twist it and turn it to mean something unhelpful. And so it has to come from a different place. The language is part of the problem, but also times it's often part of the problem of the heart as well.
You're agreeing, Lisa. What would you like to add as far as Quentin's last statement is a problem of the heart? The language we use is a problem of the heart. What do you hear when he says that?
I think that sometimes people use language to exclude others. I like to use the term special needs, and that can refer to someone with dietary needs as well as someone with behavioral needs and physical needs. But there are those in that community that don't like that term because they feel that it separates them, that they then would be separated into a special class rather than included in to the mainstream congregation or the mainstream classroom. So I think it's based on where is your heart? Is your heart into including everybody into the life of the community and not labeling people, but to find maybe descriptors for their needs rather than a label to plaster onto them.
Right. Quentin, I see you wanted to
yeah,
chime
I was
in.
going to say, let me just also throw in, I think one of the problems we also have is that oftentimes this is language that's being imposed on communities rather than in conversation with communities. You know, there's not enough conversation with people who either, whether you talk about it with exceptionalities or people affected by disability, and how they view it. You know, there are some I think would say, no, it's a disability. I'm disabled. Others say, no, this is something that, you know, is a part of my exceptional being. And I think that part of it comes back to the way in which we approach human beings in conversation with them rather than imposing language on them.
So in light of that, what can congregations do to create a different type of space for those who are with them that we all have special needs?
That's right.
I love that language because we all have different needs that are different from one another, and how can we be open and vulnerable to that reality that I need you and you need me in different ways? And so what can churches do? Quentin, do you want to make that space where we are hearing from those?
Sure.
And helping them to create the language?
Yeah, let me start with, in fact, you may have introduced me to the book, but the book by Thomas Reynolds, Vulnerable Communion, I think is a great, helpful starting place. Reynolds in his book, Vulnerable Communion, talks about this idea that we all live in a broken world and all as a result have some kind of vulnerability. But we also live in a world that wants to ignore that, hide that, or gloss over that. And so what happens is we live what he calls a cult of normalcy. We all buy into this belief that everything's okay, but there are degrees to which people can fit into that and which they can't. And the more that you fit into whatever this cult of normalcy is, the more received and more welcomed you are. And I think what we have to begin to do in congregations is start to break down this understanding that everybody is all normal, whatever normal is, and begin to recognize and appreciate the fact that we all have brokenness in our life. We all have these areas in our lives where we need other people to welcome and receive us as we are, not just as they want us to be. And I think the starting place is there. And beyond that, then it's then creating the space for people to be able to share their story, to be open with their different vulnerabilities, their different broken areas of brokenness, so that they can then, as return, receive the care of the congregation and give care in the congregation.
So a mutual reciprocal process.
Absolutely.
That we all have something to give to one another.
Yeah.
Lisa, what are your thoughts on?
It reminds me of Henry Nouwen talking about brokenness, and that we all have a sense of brokenness about us. And that when we recognize that in ourselves, then we can accept it in others and find a commonality and find that we all have something important to contribute to one another. And I think that that is where we need to start, like you said.
Yeah.
Well, Quentin and I are both ministers, pastors, and oftentimes we train those to not bring themselves into a sermon, but there are some limitations to, there are some strengths to bringing ourselves, to how we bring ourselves as an example in the sermon. And so I want to pose the question, in what ways can pastors, preachers, teachers help people, the congregates that they are educating, that they are nurturing, shepherding, to see their vulnerability? What are some concrete ways this will happen, and what are some concrete ways that you have seen, experienced it happen, Lisa, even as a member?
Well, I think just to be able to say to a congregation, I have this weakness. I've experienced this. Maybe I haven't shared that same experience, but I do have this experience. And so together we can share and strengthen one another.
Quentin.
Yeah, I think there's been a danger in the way in which we approach the professionalization of the laity, of the clergy, that creates this context of other than, apart from the congregation. And one of the things that I think has been helpful, at least in my own preaching, are those moments where I have openly shared my vulnerabilities. You know, there's some limits. You have certain power when you're in that space that you want to be careful about how you use it. Not that it's abusive or coercive. But there is also the power of helping to shape, and maybe the word that we'd use is betraying normalcy. So like Lisa, I have my own chronic issues. I have an immune system issue that I receive treatment for on a weekly basis. Without it, you know, it's life-threatening. And so I'm pretty open about sharing that, both in the classroom as well as in the congregational life, and so that people can understand that, you know, this is a part of our human existence. And in the midst of that, God can be redeeming through that. So I would agree.
As we're vulnerable. Okay.
Absolutely.
We're getting ready to take a break, and we will come back. Thank you.
KNXT, the nation's only full-powered broadcast station owned and operated by a Catholic diocese in the U.S. and streaming live on the internet at knxt.tv, need your support to keep the message of the good news alive. Just go to knxt.tv, click on the Make a Financial Gift, go to Donate, and fill out your one-time or monthly offering under PayPal. It's just that easy. Your donation makes it possible for KNXT, Catholic Television, to continue its ministry by celebrating the Mass and proclaiming the gospel. Thank you from KNXT.
With Lisa Keith, who is assistant professor at Fresno Pacific University of Special Ed, and Quentin Kennison, associate professor of Christian Ministry and Leadership, as we try to help congregations engage exceptional children, adults, and families in responding to their faith and spiritual needs. So before the show, we were looking at the different ways language and spaces and practices congregations can do, but sometimes there are some deep-held beliefs that are hard to crack by both laity and clergy, such as when a person is born, quote unquote, not normal with a physical or mental disability, many perceive that as being punished by God, that this is God afflicting them for something they have done in the past or the present or have not done. What are your thoughts around that very deep sense of belief that God is castigating me? Lisa, you want to respond to that?
When I was first diagnosed, I wondered why it had to happen to me. And then as I began to work through it, I realized that, you know what, I don't think it's a thing of God. God is love. But I think that He is able to use that into speak into other people's lives, that, you know, if I can continue on and work and live and have children and minister to others in whatever way that I can, then so can the next person. So I think that it's normal in this human existence to have a need of some kind, whether it is a mental health issue or a physical illness or what have you. I think we have to normalize it.
Right, so we're switching what it constitutes as normal, but at the same time you raise an interesting question. Do you think it's normal for us to try to blame a higher being or the deity or the God in the process as part of the human experience?
I think it's normal to question. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's okay, because I think when I was diagnosed, that's what led me to the church. I had not been a Christian prior to my diagnosis, and it was in my search for the meaning behind it that I was able to find the love of God.
Quentin, please share your perspective on that deep-held popular belief.
Yeah, I think it seems to be one that persists, which is, first of all, is interesting. Every time I think we've moved beyond that, I find somebody else who seems to hold it. My first thought is I'm immediately taken to John 9, where Jesus is encountering a man who's born blind, and his disciples go to that place. They ask, who sinned, this man or himself, that he was born blind, which is an interesting question in light of the fact he hadn't even been born yet, so he must have done something to deserve this. And Jesus' response is, neither. Now, I'm not sure I'm completely understand what Jesus' next part is. He was born this way so that God might be glorified. That has its own troubling elements that I struggle with all the time. But it seems pretty clear that Jesus is, at least on the outset, debunking this idea that they deserved this. And I think that's an important element of it. I think the other thing, there are two other thoughts that come to mind. The other one is this idea, thinking about how Paul himself seemed to struggle with something, this thorn in the flesh. Whatever that means, a special need. And yet somehow through that, God was able to help him understand that His grace was sufficient in the midst of that. And that he was not to be an excluded person, but rather he was the person who was drawing others in to the kingdom, to God's work. And so that was important. And then the last thought I have processing through this is reflected back in a story in 2 Kings where the people of Israel receive the blessing of God's salvation through 4 lepers. These lepers are the ones through whom God speaks into the life of Israel His salvation. And so the importance of how inclusion of all people into the life of the congregation really becomes essential, because it may be that that's the way God is meaning to bring His word to us in this process. So those are a couple of the areas. I do think, I completely agree with Lisa in this idea that questioning is completely normal and it's helpful, because I think it is a way in which we draw to God. I don't know that God always gives us the answers we want, but I do believe that God is always attempting to be present with us in that process.
Right, and that seems like to be the underlying thread, the making meaning in the midst of the situation. How do we make meaning as human beings to what is happening to us and through us as we respond, and what is our responsibility in the midst of that? And moving on to the more personal experiences of our own special needs. Therese Burchard, who's the author, shares a very interesting quote regarding those who suffer with a mental disability, because when she states in her comment that mental illness is not an easy disease. With it, there is no cast or oxygen tank, just some lame story about some bad thoughts. Share what you think about her comments. Do you find that has significance and relevance to what people with mental illness suffer with, or what? Let's begin with you, Lisa.
I think it's very relevant because we're afraid to share our innermost thoughts when they're of depression or self-hate or self-anger or any of those perceived as negative thoughts. So we don't want to share them because we think that other people won't take us seriously, won't find that they're valuable, that they have realness to them. So I think that's what many of us feel like when we are prompted to share what we're thinking and feeling, when the exact opposite is true, that they're not just lame thoughts, they're not just bad thinking. It's a deeper sense of, I need to share myself with you so that you can come alongside me.
So it's more like an invitation in which those of us who are not willing to be open leave you isolated in the process.
And that's where the true suffering
Yes.
of having a mental illness occurs. It's that
Yes.
isolation.
Right.
I often think that if someone had taken Robin Williams dinner that night, that maybe he'd still be with us today. Someone should have taken him dinner. And that was what I had said to a friend of mine when I heard of his passing. If someone had a cancer, there would be meal trains there for him. But because he had this invisible disease, this invisible illness, and there's fear surrounding it, no one wanted to participate in helping him.
So those of us who are supposedly able have to penetrate our disability to enter in to be with you.
Right.
Yeah. Quinn, what are your thoughts to the quote of Therese Burchard?
Well, I think, again, I think you really touched nicely on the reality of the exclusion that's a part of that. The perception, right, that these are these lame thoughts. And the way in which oftentimes that our approach to folks that are affected by disability are more about our attempt to try to fix the situation, right, to repair it so that they can fit back into this cult of normalcy again, right? Rather than recognizing the way in which we are actually participating in their exclusion by doing so. And so when we can get past that, we can sit and be with somebody and not feel the need to try to fix them.
Exactly.
I think there's something healthy and hopeful about that.
Right, and that's a nice segue into looking at the whole concept of universal design and the ways that we all have access.
Right.
And there's a particular cartoon quote, Lisa, that I want you to be able to speak the audience through, that when those of us who suffer with a disability or who have special needs or exceptional, when they are given access, we are all given access. So explain the cartoon to the audience.
In the cartoon, there's a young person who uses a wheelchair and several of his peers, and they all want to get into the school building. There's a ramp and there's stairs and they're covered in snow, and the janitor wants to shovel the stairs first so that the majority of kids could get in, but the one who uses a wheelchair won't have access. And he says, if you'll just shovel the ramp, we can all get in. And that's really what we need to be doing, is thinking in terms of, in our classrooms, in our churches, in our buildings, thinking in terms of access for the person who uses a wheelchair, the person who uses a cane, the person who has a stroller with small children. How can everyone be included? Yeah.
Quentin, what are your thoughts on that particular description of that cartoon?
Well, because I come out of the life of the church as a minister and such, I have thought often about the way in which our buildings are often built without access. The church I served in Arizona, a beautiful congregation of people, lovely, loving people. But we put the children on the second floor of a building that didn't have an elevator or any kind of a ramp access. And so the one or two times we did have somebody come to visit with church who had somebody in a wheelchair, for instance, in this case, they had to be carried up these stairs. And it was such a demeaning kind of approach that the family never came back. And so I think back to that thing again, when we create access for all people, we really are creating access for those who are maybe most vulnerable in this conversation. The other thing I'll add to that is I think that there is a certain way in which we recognize it in some contexts but not in others. What does it mean to have access? Again, we talk about the wheelchair, that one seems obvious, but what about somebody who has some kind of an emotional disability? What about somebody who has some kind of a mental disability? How do we create access there for people so that when we're engaged in worship, when we're engaged in Bible study, we're creating the kind of space that is safe for them to encounter the God of the universe, which, by the way, is never a safe space. And in doing so, right, create access for all people. I think that's really the challenge.
We have to go out and find opportunities. We have to make it a point to find opportunities for everyone to participate. How can they participate? So the young person who has difficulty with executive functioning, who maybe can't sit still for 25 minutes at a time, maybe that young person can be taught how to collect the offering or pass out or be a greeter, or what are the ways we can all participate?
So have a broad array of opportunities based
Yes.
upon the skills and the giftings that is among us
That's
as
right.
we, as the body of Christ, share life together. Well, in 30 seconds or less, what is one thought that you would like for the viewing audience to walk away with? Beginning with you, Quinn. 30 seconds or less.
I think it's important to recognize the miracles of Jesus are oftentimes misunderstood. They're understood as healings, for instance. And I think what we miss in that is what Jesus is doing in his cultural context is he's reintegrating people that are excluded into the life of society. And I think if we could get to the point where we were living out that kind of an ethos without expecting people to have their disability disappear, we would be fulfilling Jesus' healing ministry.
Thank you. Lisa, 30 seconds or less.
It reminds me of the Fresno Pacific idea in which all people have innate value and are to be included in the community. So how can we invite people back into relationship with one another?
Well, thank you for being on the show today, and
Thank
thank you for watching. You can watch Perspectives on Faith and Culture on Thursdays at 8 p.m. and Fridays at 1 p.m. or online at KNXT.TV. And we thank you for watching today. Take care and God bless.